Good evening. My name is Bashir Fancy. I am one of the founding members and president at BIZTEK Professional Association of Canada, or BTPAC, and I'm very happy to bring you a recording that I had done with Ryan Poissant of the Mars at the time, and I'll give you a little background on him. We are part of ICCP, and we are obviously involved in education, training, mentoring, and certification for computing professionals. So hopefully you will join us. We'll have our website up, but if you need to look at what type of courses we have and certification, you can go to iccp.org. Also, you can send us an email at info@ptpac.org, as you see it on the slide, or you can join us. There are no fees for the next 12 months, and we're hoping to make that permanent, but we'll keep you informed by sending us your details at join@btpac.org. That way, we'll keep you informed of all the webinars we're doing, and otherwise, you'll have to register for each of them separately. Very quickly, Brian Poisson, when he did, it was actually part of the Mars Discovery District, and it was helping corporate partners, basically connecting to the innovation ecosystem and delivering education programs, and so forth. Now, prior to Ryan joining Mars, he was the vice president of marketing at Customer One, an enterprise software organization. He's a very smart fellow, and you'll see as he comes through. Recently, this is long after he spoke, he's been named the chief operating officer of Toronto-based Nudge Rewards, and that's who Ryan Poisson is. So I won't hold up too much here because I want you to actually hear his presentation. And I want to thank again in advance here for what Ryan did for us, and look forward to his presentation. All the best. Enjoy.
Thank you, Bashir. Very nice to be with everyone this evening. As mentioned, my name is Ryan Poissant. I am the Senior Director of Corporate Engagement at Mars. Mars is an innovation hub based in downtown Toronto. We work with a portfolio of a little over 1,100 organizations, startups that are from beyond an idea through to scaling with multiple rounds of venture capital behind them. We do that in the areas of health, energy and the environment, finance and commerce, and then work and learning. So Mars also includes a fairly large physical aspect to it. There's a 1.5 million square foot building, which, based on that sort of size, makes us the largest urban-based innovation center in all of North America. Delighted to be with you this evening and sharing a little bit more about a common theme that certainly everyone involved in this group has embraced on a day-to-day life. That is, technology is eating the world, and wanted to share a little bit more with you about how startups are leading the way and what does that really look like. So. First, some hieroglyphics. I'm showing my age a little bit, but I did this recently for a group of MBAs, and nobody could tell me who Pac-Man was. But that is a statement that Mark Andreessen made. Software is eating the world. Now, what's interesting is that Mark made this sort of proclamation in August of 2011 in an article that he penned for the Wall Street Journal. And why he did that was he looked around at the time and saw that the largest music company was really iTunes. The largest video company was something that was completely run by computer software at the time, which is Pixar. And Disney, who invented the concept of animation, actually bought Pixar. He looked around and saw that the largest bookseller was not Barnes & Noble in physical space with bricks and mortar, but actually Amazon. There were a number of these really interesting sort of scenarios evolving where it was an underlying technology platform that was powering somebody that was a large category leader. Video content distribution, that's Netflix. And so what he saw was, there was this change that was coming, and ultimately, penned the article to try and tell everyone, hey, I think this is a big deal, and we should all kind of, get on board here. Ultimately, what was driving that was, the combination of Moore's law, making, the supercomputer broadly available in everyone's pocket, and not only that, being attached to a high bandwidth internet that allows all these supercomputers to be networked together, and making the foundation for many, advanced business models possible that couldn't have been in the past. So our old friend Moore's Law was at work, and what he saw was that, the price of computing had come down, and the opportunity for people to leverage these tools has continued to increase, and that was driving a whole bunch of change. Now, inside of the mainstream corporate world, this was sort of greeted as ho-hum business as usual. We've got profits here, we've got things that are very important to us. There are 90-day cycles. This whole technology innovation thing sounds kind of interesting, but hey, we got work to do here. We got quarterly earnings to report on. And so, not a lot of folks kind of stood up and took notice across sort of many established and entrenched industries. At the same time, though, startups were taking advantage of this advances in tools, and they were leveraging these new capabilities in order to, keep calm and seize the means of production, as it were. So we'd like to introduce you to Eric Ries. Eric is the author of a book called The Lean Startup, and really it was the beginning of a movement around embracing lean principles to figure out how to bring startups together. But Eric's got some really interesting thoughts on why this matters to corporate Canada. Here's a quick clip.
I've spent a lot of time with major companies where I'm considered some kind of innovation expert, whatever that means. Like, is that an oxymoron? I don't know. Is that a contradiction in terms? Can you be an innovation expert? I don't know. But anyway, I get the phone call now from companies who want to know, why should my big company innovate? And I always tell them the same thing. It's because your company will die otherwise. And they get so offended. Like, we are a 100-year-old company with, we're the leader in our mind. I'm like, hey, listen. You called me. I'm just telling you what I think. And then I try to tell them stories about, a kid with a credit card, with $1,000 budget. I just saw him build a product that from the consumer's point of view is indistinguishable from your highly polished, multi-year generation, established product. And their first reaction is always the same. Well, we'll just buy that kid if his product is successful. And I'm like, you're not understanding the moral of the story. It's not that this one kid with a credit card can do this. Anyone with a credit card can rent the means of production and compete with you on a first-class basis in their market. And so you're not dealing with one potential competitor, but with thousands or millions. Are you really geared up for innovation at that pace? And that's usually when they hang up the phone and say, we're going to call a different expert to tell us what posters to put on the wall. We're looking for easy answers, not that kind of stuff. But I think that is what is so exciting about technology today. It's that, it's like putting Karl Marx on his head. Anybody can rent the means of production, which means entrepreneurship is becoming truly democratized, which means nobody is safe. All of our process diagrams are linear box diagrams that go one way, but entrepreneurship is fundamentally iterative, so our diagrams need to be in circles. We have to be willing to be wrong and to fail, but modern management says failure means you get dinged. For example, one of the things I've tried to do is to tell companies, put on your employees' performance evaluation a concept we call productive failure. How many productive failures did you have this year? If someone comes to you and claims that they didn't fail this year, one of two things. They're either lying to your face, or they were incredibly, unbelievably conservative. In both cases, it's actually not a positive attribute. You want to say, show me a time when you failed but learned something really valuable, where you were able to pivot to something from something that didn't work to something that did work. Or I have a lot of examples now where you save the company an incredible amount of money. Because instead of spending $10 million on something, we spent $100,000, did an experiment that proves conclusively there ain't no business here. Executive sponsorship of a startup is about learning and supporting the team and going on the journey with them. It's not about reviews and evaluation and stage gate, go kill decisions. So it's a really different change, at the executive level, at the middle manager level, and at the implementer, line manager level, required to do this thing. But on the other hand, the alternative is to die. So I feel like, yes, it's hard, but that's better than having your company go the way of Kodak or BlackBerry or, pick your favorite company in the last few years that's gone from $100 billion market cap to $5 billion, and ask yourself, was playing it safe actually that safe? I don't see the evidence that that's true. I think what's happening in government today is actually very exciting. I mean, people look at the political dysfunction that makes it into the cable news programs, and you're like, oh God, we got problems. And listen, we got problems, no doubt. But behind the scenes, off the radar, not where people are willing to put the cameras, are really small but I think very hopeful signs that we are stumbling our way to a whole new form of governance that is much more about the government as a creator of platforms that allow citizens to solve their own problems. To me, one of the most precious commodities that government is hoarding at the moment is data. And we have an opportunity to turn that data into useful solutions if we're willing to open it up and allow citizens who ultimately paid for the collection of that data to have access to it. So this is not about, revealing people's private secrets. Rather, it's about taking the data that's already being lawfully and legally collected and making programmatic access to that information available to everybody. And when you do that, you see incredible innovation start to open up, because I think what we are on the verge of is what I call a pro-entrepreneurship public policy. To be pro-entrepreneurship as a matter of public policy means to make government a tool for helping entrepreneurs get started. That's what we want. Startups are experiments. So just like in a science lab, the more experiments you run, the more likely you are to create something great. So you got to ask yourself, what's going to make it more likely for someone to start a startup in the first place? Open data is one such thing. If you give people access to the tools of the information about what's happening in the world, you give them the opportunity to stumble on more novel solutions.
And so I want to let that sink in a little bit. The means of production this is a really important point. I founded a startup in the early 2000s in a much different environment, and my co-founder and I were buying servers off of eBay, $45,000 pieces of equipment for $4,500, and we thought we had the whole world in the palm of our hand. We were so excited that we could do this. We spent a lot of time and a lot of money just setting up plumbing, just basic infrastructure. Before you could start to build anything or get into the lines of code, you had to have a sandbox and you had to understand what a production environment could look like. And this whole notion of scalability was super important. Nowadays, you just dip your credit card and you can spin up any environment that you want in almost real time. And gosh, gee, if we get to be successful, then we end up with a bit of a scaling challenge. That's okay. They just charge you a little bit more money to your credit card. These elements of plumbing and infrastructure have been removed from the startup experience. So this is not really new. This whole notion of having to compete has always happened. So, our old friend Jack Welch reminds us, hey, if the rate of change on the outside exceeds the rate of change on the inside, the end is near. Right? We've always had competitive forces. We've always had changes in technology, shifts in the landscape, competitive talent challenges. All these things are really important, and it's always been, critical that we understood how to adjust to the things that were going on outside of our organization, so that we could make changes faster than the rest of the environment. So what's different this time around? Well, really, because of the confluence of things and the technology changes and the access to the means of production, what's happened is the world has never really seen this on hyperspeed before. Right? Nobody's seen this where we punch it and go into the fastest external environment that anyone in their career has ever seen. It used to be that staying on top of current trends meant that you read Harvard Business Review or some other periodical that was published on a quarterly basis, and you worked your way through it, hopefully kind of consuming enough before the next one showed up. And that counted as the ability to consume interesting leadership type content and stay on top of evolving trends. Nowadays, we probably all consume more information between the start of the day and lunch on one day in bite-sized tidbits and number of contact points than we would have over an entire month previously. And that's just because the world is moving really fast. There's lots of content producers, there's lots of best practices, there are lots of people with principles and models to share, and it gets really hard to kind of sort out what's real and what's not. But most importantly, it's really hard to keep your eye on all of the latest evolving solutions that are coming into your marketplace. So, we're going to talk about a big idea. There's another guy we're going to talk about named Steve Blank, who's a successful entrepreneur in his own right, a tech entrepreneur, a pioneer in the early days of Silicon Valley. And he's important in the lean movement. But he has this thing, he says, big idea. We no longer compete on a product or a service, but rather a competitive, repeatable, and scalable business model. What do we mean by that? Well, there was this place not that long ago that I could go to, and it was kind of near my house, and it had good access to parking, and I could wander in, and on one side of the building was on one wall we had sort of all the new releases and latest and greatest kind of organized, and then as we circled around, there were different genres available, and I could wander my way through and pick up popcorn and licorice and any other refreshments that I wanted. Come up to the my turn in line and have an awkward exchange with the person behind the counter about why it's the 8th time I've rented beaches, and then I could take my movie home and enjoy my content in the privacy of my own home. And then it was just as simple to go back the next day, drive in, and there was even a little slot. I didn't have to go into the building. I could just return it there. Blockbuster could have spent all kinds of time optimizing on more selection of video. They could have had better products available. They could have had cheaper prices on licorice and ice cream. They could have optimized any level of my service experience. But what they failed to comprehend and really embrace was that their business model was rapidly becoming obsolete. There is a pipe that goes into everyone's home. That pipe can carry content. I no longer need to leave my home to procure content in order to consume it and then return it the next day. That's what we talk about when we mean that repeatable and scalable business models are now what we're competing on, as opposed to just simply products and services. And with that, there's some really interesting data that says that even if you do, find yourself in a repeatable, scalable business model situation, it's getting harder and harder to stay on top. This is the life expectancy of, the S&P 500. So these are the folks who are leading and doing it the best. Large corporates, generally in the past in very defensible kinds of industries. As you can see, the life expectancy continues to reduce and is projected to continue to decline. So, the notion that what got you here is going to carry you through the future is rapidly evaporating from underneath everyone's feet. We have to really understand how to keep our eye on the future and retool, or else we're at risk of going the way of Blockbusters and the Kodaks of the world. I want to talk a little bit about technology and where things have kind of evolved. Now, it used to be that the largest companies were in, again, more traditional industries. 2001, you've got GE, you've got Exxon, you've got Citibank and Walmart. Microsoft managed to slip in there. But you fast forward 10 years, we've still got Exxon, now in the lead here. We've got Apple instead of Microsoft as the lone sort of tech company in the top 5 by market cap. And we're heavily dominated by natural resources with PetroChina and Shell rounding out sort of the top 5. If you take a look at what happens in 2016, that 5 years since Mark Andreessen sort of sounded the alarm bell, the world's shifted a fair bit in terms of market cap, largest companies by market cap. Apple, Alphabet, which is the reformed Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and Facebook make up the top 5 companies by market cap in 2016. This evolution is happening, right before our eyes, and it has a lot to do with every large organization that's out there. I think the best way to kind of illustrate this is to give you an example of this notion of unbundling. So this is a Wells Fargo kind of login page that you would see from their website. And this is an example of what that login page, the top being personal and the bottom being small business, looks like when you start to add all of these smaller, startup companies. These are funded ventures who have said, hey, I can take a slice out of what was previously thought of as a bundled offering from a large bank. I can develop a value proposition and deliver services in such a way that allows me to create a scalable business model and start to take small bite-sized chunks out of these large incumbents in a number of ways. So large banks, once thought of as very protected, institutions with lots of governance and compliance and barriers to entry, are being unbundled with small bite-sized chunks from a number of upstarts or startup companies that have figured out a way to service those customers in a different way, and customers are starting to migrate towards that. Not all of these companies will survive, but they are a great example of how many organizations exist that are trying to take on what was once thought of as sort of sacred ground, which is the banking industry. And lest you think this is just something that's a Silicon Valley kind of world, this is also happening, in Europe. This is HSBC, but it's the same kind of activity. Different set of companies to a large extent, but the same sort of unbundling is happening in this industry. So what if we look at other sort of traditionally capital-intensive industries, the auto industry? So, innovation used to come out of Detroit. It doesn't anymore. It comes out of Silicon Valley. It comes out of areas where, technology is leading the way. There are unmanned vehicles that are being run by Uber in Pittsburgh as a pilot test. There are lots of self-driving vehicles in California that are going through tests right now. General Motors actually spent $1 billion purchasing a company called Cruise that was about 18 months old because they had built the technology that was required for a self-driving car. And GM said, you know what, we'd much rather acquire, this intellectual property, this intellectual capital, this team by buying a startup versus try and figure out how to do this on our own. And so you see a number of partnerships that are happening between ride-sharing programs like Lyft and Uber with large, manufacturers. Things are changing rapidly in the auto industry, even to a point where how you purchase cars. There's a test being run right now over in Italy that you can buy a Fiat on Amazon. There was an announcement recently that Walmart was going to pilot, auto sales on their website so you could buy online. So there's just lots of change happening in what we thought of as the old guard of manufacturing, capital-intensive manufacturing and assembly, like automotive. All right, what about other things that require big investments in infrastructure? How about lodging? Well, as it turns out, the largest organization inside of the hotel and lodging industry is actually Airbnb, and they don't have any hotel rooms that they own. This is an example of other parts of the hotel and travel experience that are being picked apart by startups. And what about the most boring thing we can think of? What about something like air conditioning and HVAC? Well, it's happening there too. Honeywell, who makes things like thermostats and other really mundane but very useful kinds of devices and technology that go into residential and commercial buildings, they're not immune from this either. This is a list of folks that are taking on the bits and pieces of what Honeywell currently does. This is for the residential kind of section. So it gives you a taste of what's going on with startups and how they're embracing sort of this lower cost of barrier of entry in order to take and utilize these tools to bring solutions to marketplace and starting to pick off smaller groups of customers that are starting to grow and say, hey, if somebody can deliver this for me, good or better, faster, then cheaper, I'm all in on trying that experience. And they're starting to win and pulling customer segment market share away from the incumbents. So what are these crazy things called startups? Well, you might have a vision of this, which is two kids, in the basement playing with some interesting technology. This happens to be from War Games, and that's Matthew Broderick trying to dial up a game of global thermonuclear war from 1982's popular flick. Incidentally, for me and maybe many of you, the first time I ever saw a computer attached to a telephone, which changed the whole world of what it could do and what it was possible if you could talk to other computers, the first concept of networking. If you're paying attention to the press, though, and you're watching some media and some of the industry publications, your view of a startup might look something like this. There's a group of, smug 20-somethings who all have their matching, t-shirts and hoodies on, wearing jeans and sneakers, who have apparently discovered some secret to the universe that we weren't even sure that we were supposed to be looking for. And they're all going to be rich in 18 months and because they have figured the whole thing out. Likely, the reality is somewhere in between. There's a lot of noise and press inside of startup land, and it does a really good job of anything that's sort of new becomes a flavor of the moment, and some things last and some things don't. But there's certainly a lot of noise inside of the startup ecosystem, locally, Toronto, Canada, as well as the Valley and other parts of the world. So the reality is that there are some interesting nuances of what makes a startup different from sort of a regular company. And back to Steve Blank, who as I mentioned, is an author, but he's also a professor. He teaches at Stanford and UC Berkeley. He characterizes a startup as a temporary organization designed to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. And we contrast that with a company, which is really a permanent organization designed to execute a repeatable and scalable business model. So startups are, this notion of temporary and searching is really important. At the end of the day, this is a new approach to solving an existing problem, and there's a whole bunch of experimentation that goes on where you're looking to find evidence of repeatability that is a really important first step, and that happens long before you actually become a company as we traditionally think about them. The other contrast is in the way they're sort of organized. So on the left, we've got General Motors just sort of post-World War II. A typical hierarchy, a series of boxes. This is your job. Congratulations if you did really well, and maybe you did one more thing that wasn't inside that box. You get the opportunity to move to a lateral box or maybe up a box, organized in such a way that allows for dissemination of information and a whole bunch of really great sort of process level kinds of things. On the right, startups think a little differently, but the things that they rely on, the core of any sort of founding startup team, has three main elements in it. This can be multiple people, not necessarily three people, it can be two people, but you've got to have sort of a hacker or the ability to kind of build something, who's the technology person that can get stuff done and control those means of production. The hustler, not in the sense that they would take you for money, but they are the person who gets out of bed and wants to move the world forward in any way that they deem possible and are willing to go through, around, over, under brick walls in order to get to realizing their vision of the future. And then a hipster or a visionary, which is somebody who kind of pulls together, what is the user experience? What is that I want to deliver? Whose pain is it that I'm solving? How do I translate that into the tools, into the things that we need for the people who build, solutions? And how does that work with our business model and how we go out and get the other things that we need to take this idea and validate it and turn it into, a repeatable, scalable business model? So those are the three competencies that are resident in any really successful startup founding team and first layer of kind of employees as they move from idea to validated kind of concept. There's a different mentality around as well. This is not your gold watch kind of club. They do not look for the pension plan and 30 years of service. These are folks who believe in doing something that is most likely bigger than themselves, and it's something that hasn't been really done this way before. So they're comfortable in an environment where there's a lot of risk and there's no playbook, and they're trying to figure it out as they go. They're willing to do extreme things. They're willing to go outside of the lines of what normal folks would do to get the data they need to try and figure out how to move this thing forward. There's a sense of optimism that we don't know how this will turn out, but we have really positive thoughts on how this could turn out. Meritocracy, this is less about title and fiefdom building and more about, are we part of a team that can continue to grow and be part of something bigger? So at the end of the day, what this really creates is an agile learning culture. It's a requirement. Now, the other thing that startups kind of have going for them is they have three numbers that they're always kind of aware of, and that's how much money do we have, how fast are we spending that money on salaries and overheads and the experiments that we need to run in order to get the data we need to validate our model, whether that's acquiring customers or proving out sort of some of the science behind our products. And then when does this all come to an end if we triangulate against a calendar? At what point do we have to stop doing this because we couldn't attract revenue or we couldn't find additional investment? And what those things do is they create a strong bias for action. These folks do not have the luxury of sitting around and waiting or getting stuck in analysis paralysis. They just simply won't exist. So, they take that strong bias for action, and you combine that with an agile learning culture, and you've got, an organization or a team that really needs to move very quickly and put the minimal amount of inputs into something and get the maximum amount of outputs out of something. And that's what differentiates them from a lot of, corporate organizations and even a lot of entrepreneurial kinds of groups that are set up inside of corporates. In a lot of cases, success and failure means the difference between paying your employees and having the ability to kind of run the rest of your life in terms of cash at that early stage of your organization. So strong bias for action there. I want to talk a little bit about lean. Lean is something that kind of often gets oversimplified in my view of something that is sort of like fail fast. We got to fail. And ultimately, it's not really about failure. It's more about validated learning. But if you're to boil it down, lean is a methodology that favors experimentation over elaborate planning, customer feedback over intuition, and iterative design over traditional upfront development. This whole notion of how can we do things on very small increments and do them in a way where we feel like we're getting smarter and smarter along the way, and we're de-risking this overall initiative because we've been taking small steps to find the right pieces of data rather than doing a whole bunch of guessing up front. At the heart of this is something called a lean loop. So build, measure, learn is something every startup is very familiar with, and it's a very important process. Essentially, you need to build something, whether that's something we call a minimum viable product or a mock-up or a proof of concept or something very light. And don't pretend that you know all the answers, and don't spend a lot of time sitting inside of your own team's black box guessing at what you think the customer wants. Get that, whatever it is, out in the hands of the right people, and then see what you learn, because it's always going to be very important to have that customer feedback as they pull you through this iterative process. And the teams that win are the ones that go through this loop very quickly with a lot of great efficiency, gathering learnings, translating those into what they build, measuring the next iteration of that, and then gathering more learnings and keep going around and around. That's the secret to doing this very efficiently and avoiding waste, which is resources that are deployed where you don't actually advance your cause. When we take a look at sort of how our startups kind of built, there's really 4 stages from going from almost a blank sheet of paper and an idea right through to an actual ongoing company. And this is some pioneering work that Steve Blank did a number of years ago. He wrote a book called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany, which was kind of a weighty textbook that didn't get a lot of love in the press. It wasn't very easy to read, but inside of that, there were a lot of really great frameworks and ideas. And this is one that has survived, and it's sort of also at the heart of the lean sort of methodology for startups. It's called the customer development cycle. And ultimately, it's a series of loops that come together. Customer discovery, where you kind of take your ideas and guesses and translate that into something that you can go and show people to get some feedback. And then once you start to see that the data is starting to form lines as opposed to dots, and you're on a good pathway, you need to sort of run some experiments to validate that that's really true. And then once you get through sort of the second stage of customer validation, you've hit what we call sort of product market fit. And then congratulations, you've got all the problems of a large company, which is competitive forces and talent acquisition and all those kinds of things. But in advance of that, you're just searching for a repeatable business, and it's a really interesting process. So we've got a 2-minute clip here from Steve Blank himself on really explaining what it means to kind of take an idea, build something, and then get out of the building to go test it, and why it's important that these things are all in circular loops.
Let's take a look at the first step in customer discovery. You're going to be living this for the next couple of weeks if you're doing this for real. Phase 1 is you state your hypotheses and you draw the business model canvas. And again, you put the canvas on the wall, you and your team get around and put up yellow stickies. But the next step is you get out of the building. You're going to test the problem. You're going to test your understanding of the customer's problem or need, and you're going to figure out how to build the prototype. The next thing is you're going to test the solution. And you're going to test the solution if you're on the web by building a low fidelity and then a high fidelity prototype. And you're going to again test your understanding of the customer's needs and whether your solution matches it. And this match, again, is called product market fit. That's the holy grail for entrepreneurs. Am I building something that people can't get enough of or are just willing to open up their wallets and empty it in front of you to get their hands on? And the 4th phase in customer discovery is you verify or pivot. Do people agree that you're solving a high-value problem or need? And do you understand your business model enough to start test selling, which is the next step in customer validation? Now, what's really depressing to most entrepreneurs is the answer most often the first time you go through this is heck no. And what's worse is, well, they kind of sort of like, well, kind of sort of is not a startup. Kind of sort of is people have been nice to you. The only time you know that you have something that's worth investing your time and money in is if people are literally trying to force their money on you or can't use your product even in its buggy, uninitialized form enough. This is what you're looking for. And if you haven't found it yet, that's why the customer development process is an iterative circle. It assumes you will be going through this multiple times. And when you finally think you do have something that matches customer needs, you get to the next step, which is customer validation.
And so you can see that this whole notion of going through the loop is really important. So is the notion of pivoting. Oftentimes the worst sins an organization or a group of individuals trying to test a new idea or validate a new idea can commit is to pretend that they have all the answers, and they can spend all kinds of time jamming more features and functionality in there and forget that it needs to get out of the building and go talk to other people, and let the data lead you along the way. But most often you're going to be wrong the first couple of times, and that's why it's really important to do all the legwork. I'll talk a little bit about business plans now. Many of you I know from the work that we do with our corporate partners at Mars are still in a world where business plans are the language of the organization. It sort of starts off where somebody who's generally quite senior has an idea for something that could be very large and transformative. They start to socialize that idea. They take a sort of a test of the political winds to see if there's any support for that idea across management and other key influencers inside the organization. Once they get enough kind of buy-in that maybe this is a thing, they start to write out a business plan. It generally turns into a 60 to 70 page single voice long form prose kind of document that if you print it out and drop it on the table, it makes a bit of a light thunk. In there's at least 2 pages of a risk assessment, and somewhere there's a 5-year compound annual growth rate that makes a curve go up and to the right that's really attractive. By the time the writing is finished, and then we go through a budgeting cycle and a whole bunch of yay or nay decisioning from management and whatnot. It gets approval, and then maybe there's some resources assigned to it from the technology group. We do some requirements gathering. We start to think about how we cascade this thing into a waterfall. Then we start to build it, and probably 18 to 20 months later, from the time it was a really great idea, it kind of has first contact with the customer. So here's the challenge with that. What we've learned is, despite how well written a lot of business plans are, that 5-year compound annual growth rate rarely, if ever, shows up the way it was intended. And that's because as soon as a product or service comes in contact with customers, it kind of looks like chaos. It's not really neat anymore. Mike Tyson kind of said it best. Everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. And releasing a product is kind of like getting punched in the face. Only the customers, who we think we're delighting and going to be super happy if we build it, they will come, is how we sort of plan and design things in the old world. They don't always beat a pathway to our door and rejoice that we've come there. Sometimes they give us all kinds of mixed signals, and sometimes they just shrug their shoulders, and we find out that there was a misalignment there. So Steve Mike says no business plan survives first contact with customers, and that's why it's super important that you have first contact earlier in the process and you don't wait until you get all the way to the end of this long, drawn-out business plan kind of cycle before you connect with customers. So what startups use and what we advocate and teach to our corporate partners through our innovation programming is something called the Business Model Canvas. It's a tool that was designed by a gentleman named Alex Osterwalder. It was 5 years of his PhD thesis over at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. And what it is it's a set of tools with 9 boxes that allow you to express any business model in terms of these 9 key areas, and you can start to look at the interdependencies and relationships across all of them. This is meant to be used as something you put up on a wall. You use sticky notes. You take a lot of voices in and have a lot of viewpoints and gather your assumptions on who are our customers, what segments are we serving, why do they buy our products or services, what value proposition do we offer them, how do they consume those, what kind of relationship do we have, what kind of revenue models do we generate from there. And then, correspondingly, what are the things that we must do, the partners we must have, the activities we got to be good at, the resources that are around that drive our costs so that we can kind of understand this. You can map an airline to this. You can map Gillette's, razors and handles kind of business model to this. Anything that you do, you can map to the business model canvas. And it's a really great tool for putting all of your sort of assumptions in a new business, or business idea, that's a product or service you're trying to validate, into one spot. And you can start to clearly separate out, do we really know that? Is that for sure? Do we have facts to back that up? Or are these assumptions that we've made? We do this with executive teams all the time, and you'd be amazed at how many times you get senior leadership from an organization who've been working in an industry for a long time. And you say, okay, what are our 3 customer, how do we segment the customer? Who are our 3 customer personas? and you get a whole bunch of different answers around who actually is the persona for a certain set of products or solutions. And then, you dig in on what's the value proposition? What is it that we do for them? And again, you get a cross-section of answers. So it's a really great way to get a team of people on the same page and talking about the same things and identify where you know things for sure and where you've got gaps. Inside of that, specifically around sort of this customer and value proposition, this became such a valuable kind of tool that Osterwalder decided to set out and create a separate canvas around the notion of who are our customers and what it is that we do for them. And we've broken those into sort of three areas. So customers have pains, things that they don't like and they're trying to avoid; gains, things that are positive for them; and then jobs. What kind of jobs are they trying to get done? And so when we start to think about the value props that we have, we think about it in terms of gain creators, pain relievers, and then what kind of products and services do we provide for our customers to get their jobs done. And so to kind of expand on that, I want to turn to a gentleman by the name of Clayton Christensen. You might have heard of. He wrote a book called The Innovator's Dilemma way back when. He's a Harvard professor, and he has actually a consultancy firm called Innosight that just focuses on helping large firms like Procter & Gamble become more innovative and be more efficient in how things run. Christensen has taken up sort of the mantle of jobs to be done as a framework, and this whole notion of we hire products to do things for us. So I've got a great clip here that helps kind of unpack this whole notion of what do we mean by the jobs to be done framework. And so here it is.
Hi, my name's Clay Christensen. I'm a professor at the Harvard Business School. I brought with me a set of puzzles, all related to innovation. We decided that the way we teach marketing is at the core of what makes motivation difficult to achieve. The most helpful way we've thought of it so far is that we actually hire products to do things for us. And understanding what job we have to do in our lives for which we would hire a product is really the key to cracking this problem of motivating customers to buy what we're offering. So I wanted just to tell you a story about a project we did for one of the big fast food restaurants. They were trying to goose up the sales of their milkshakes. They had just studied this problem up the gazoo. They brought in customers who fit the profile of the quintessential milkshake consumer. And they'd give them samples and ask, could you tell us how we can improve our milkshakes so you'd buy more of them? Do you want it chocolatey or cheaper, chunky or chewier? They get very clear feedback. They would then improve the milkshake on those dimensions, and it had no impact on sales or profits whatsoever. So one of our colleagues went in with a different question on his mind, and that was, I wonder what job arises in people's lives that cause them to come to this restaurant to hire a milkshake. So we stood in a restaurant for 18 hours one day and just took very careful data. What time did they buy these milkshakes? What were they wearing? Were they alone? Did they buy other food with it? Did they eat it in the restaurant or drive off with it? It turned out that nearly half of the milkshakes were sold before 8 o'clock in the morning. The people who bought them were always alone. It was the only thing they bought, and they all got in the car and drove off with it. So to figure out what job they were trying to hire it to do, we came back the next day and stood outside the restaurant so we could confront these folks as they left, milkshake in hand. And in language that they could understand, we essentially asked, excuse me please, but I got to sort this puzzle out. What job were you trying to do for yourself that caused you to come here and hire that milkshake? And they'd struggle to answer, so we'd then help them by asking other questions like, well, think about the last time you were in the same situation, needing to get the same job done, but you didn't come here to hire a milkshake. What did you hire? And then as we put all of their answers together, it became clear that they all had the same job to do in the morning, and that is they had a long and boring drive to work. And they just needed something to do while they drove to keep the commute interesting. One hand had to be on the wheel, but somebody had given them another hand and there wasn't anything in it. And they just needed something to do while they drove. They weren't hungry yet, but they knew they'd be hungry by 10 o'clock, so they also wanted something that would just go down there and stay for their morning Good question. What do I hire when I do this job? I've never framed the question that way before, but last Friday I hired a banana to do the job. Take my word for it, never hire bananas. They're gone in 3 minutes, you're hungry by 7:30. If you promise not to tell my wife, I probably hire donuts twice a week, but they don't do it well either. They're gone fast, they crumb all over my clothes, they get my fingers gooey. Sometimes I hire bagels, but as you know, they're so dry and tasteless. Then I have to steer the car with my knees while I'm putting jam on them, and then if the phone rings, we got a crisis. I remember I hired a Snickers bar once, but I felt so guilty I've never hired Snickers again. Let me tell you, when I come here and hire this milkshake, it is so viscous that it easily takes me 20 minutes to suck it up that thin little straw. Who cares what the ingredients are? I don't. All I know is I'm full all morning and it fits right here in my cup holder. Well, it turns out that the milkshake does the job better than any of the competitors, which in the customers' minds are not Burger King milkshakes, but it's bananas, donuts, bagels, Snickers bars, coffee, and so on. But I hope you can see how, if you understand the job, how to improve the product becomes just obvious.
So I think that there's a lot to be gleaned from that clip. First of all, I'd like to apologize for changing the way everyone will ever think about a McDonald's milkshake forever and a day. I dare you to drive by the Golden Arches and not think about milkshakes and having Christensen say cheaper, chocolatier, chewier, chunkier in your ear. Aside from that, though, I think that if you can take something as everyday as a milkshake and you can sort of probe and peel back a little bit of, the layers to get at the root cause of why people hire those products or what is it that folks are trying to accomplish. Imagine how rich there is a data set to mine when you start to think about the complex products and services and relationships that you have with your customers for the things that they're consuming from you on a daily basis. Think about unwinding a financial product. There's lots of information that would lead you down some really interesting paths to better understand why someone chooses this credit card over another one or this other financial product at a stage in their life. If we can get insights on milkshakes, then we can get insights on anything. And I think it's a really, really interesting tool set. So a couple of things to kind of to leave you with. The entrepreneurial API, what are the tools that entrepreneurs and startups are kind of using? Well, at the heart of it is this notion of lean iteration, build, measure, learn. And that's a really important tool for us as we take and work through sort of the stages of customer development. So how do we do discovery and validation and work our way through to get to product market fit? And those are all really important because we've got this series of sort of data, but a lot of assumptions that start off in our business model canvas, right? This is a brand new thing that we're going to test out. And where do we start? Well, here's our assumptions about how the business works in the business model canvas. Then we get out of the building and validate those in the stages, and the tools that we use to validate are this build, measure, and learn kind of loop. So that's how they all kind of stack together for the entrepreneurial approach to validating any sort of business or any sort of product or solution. This is hard stuff, and Churchill kind of had it right. Success is going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. But I would say that, I think he could be more right with a tiny bit of revision in the context of this. And in the context of a startup or validating a new idea, success is going from validated learning to validated learning without loss of enthusiasm. And that's really hard. So, at the end of the day, I think I talked a bit about, this notion of fail fast. Failure is really just an unintended or unanticipated set of outcomes to an experiment in this sort of construct. So if we think back to the example that I used around long form prose and single voice in a business case where it starts with one person, let's say that that was a $2 million project that took 2 years. So if you were to go back to that and say, instead of doing the whole thing, what if we took, $200,000 and, 3 months, and we went out and tested the riskiest assumptions. And so we went out and spent $200,000, and we came back at the end of a quarter and we said, you know what, this is a bad idea. For a lot of reasons that we couldn't have figured out, we've tested the riskiest assumptions, and it says, yes, there's a lot of risk, and we should never do this. Did I just blow $200,000 Or did we just save $1.8 million and the better part of 2 years of politics and heartache and passion that could be redeployed into some other way forward, whether that's a variant on this project that's changed or whether it's a different project? And the answer is, that comes down to how you think about these things inside the organization. Did I fail, or did we create validated learning to make a better decision? And that's really at the heart of why Lean exists, is to say, how can we do things with validated learning, at the forefront and go through it? And so this, again, is not super new. It's not a radical new concept. Our old friend Jack Welch continues to remind us that an organization's ability to learn and translate that learning into action rapidly is the ultimate competitive advantage. We've always had to be really good at converting knowledge into action and being able to be better than that at the rest of the environment, right? It is the only form of competitive advantage that is sustainable in today's day and age. So this is not new. It's just sort of being brought to the front, and there's a more, broadly embraced set of tools in order to help this kind of happen. Quickly recap, sort of there's improving and inventing, and on the left we've got sort of existing business models which are known, and that's all about, improving. There's always new product development, there's always process improvement, continuous improvement, that's always going to be there. And it kind of, focuses on execution with forecasts and planning is the node of it. But, on the right, what you've got is sort of multiple business models in a world where we've got uncertainty. Think about the future of publishing or financial services or automotive industry. There's a lot of things that are happening, and every company should be thinking about different models that give them an opportunity to be drafting into the future. And that's about inventing, not just improving. It's about brand new solutions to existing problems or changing dynamics in the marketplace. And the skills required for that are really around search. How do we learn, pivot, and experiment and create a culture that embraces those things and have skills and talents inside the organization that make that possible? And as you can see in the middle, these two things aren't necessarily always congruent. It's why I think it's really hard. It's kind of like companies of the future need to be able to walk and chew gum. It's really imperative to their survival, and that's what this kind of outlines. At the end of the day, this is so much so that Osterwalder wrote a piece that appeared in HBR middle of last year, 2016, where he sort of said, will the organization of the future have two sides to it? Will it have the executional side, the traditional CEO with your C-suite across functional areas or lines of business? And then, complementing that, will we have a chief entrepreneur? Will we have the person who's in charge of, not worrying about anything that's happening today, but thinking, 3 to 5 years out and understanding trends, or thinking about where is the current business most vulnerable, and if we were to be disrupted, can we figure out a way to disrupt ourselves by putting entrepreneurs and really skilled kinds of thinkers against that problem, as opposed to waiting for somebody externally to do it. So proposed in a structure where you'd have chief portfolio manager, venture capitalist, risk officer, etc. Important to note here that he really advocates strong for the fact that this person should not report to the CEO because they have, a different aligned set of interests. They should report to the chairman of the board because the CEO has incentives and structure around short-term results, whereas an entrepreneur and the value they would derive for that organization would be more longer-term focused in nature. So in order to avoid these things being at odds, he recommends that this would be sort of on par with the C-suite and report into the chair of the board. And at the end of the day, culture eats strategy for breakfast is my favorite way to kind of say this stuff is hard. It's hard for startups. It's harder for corporations. There are lots of great answers and strategies that have been devised over the years, billions of dollars worth of great thinking that's been paid for by major consulting firms that still exist in binders and PowerPoint decks and PDF files on hard drives that never actually saw the light of day and were never fulfilled based on their potential. And that's really because culture is really hard to nail. Anybody who's doing this really well is doing it in such a way that they've licked culture. They've figured out a way to embrace this notion of doing things in an ambidextrous organization where you can walk and chew gum, and we don't have performance systems set up that punish folks who say, I'm going to run 8 experiments that are really important this year, and then if they fail on 6 of them, they end up taking the blame for it, and it impacts their performance review and their compensation. There's a lot of structural kinds of things that go into building a culture, and those really need to be changed to embrace this notion of how do we move fast, how do we create an agile learning culture and have a strong bias for action. So, lest you think all is lost, I wanted to take a couple of minutes here at the end and wrap up with a bit of a case study on somebody who has embraced some of these principles and is getting some interesting results. Talk to you a bit about Intuit. This is a case that was presented by the Chief Innovation Officer at Intuit a couple of years ago, and he starts from sort of Scott Cook, their founder, really thinks about the customer first. We improve our customers' financial lives so profoundly they can't imagine going back to the old way. That doesn't talk anything about their products. They just talk about their customers' financial lives and improvement, right? This is about customer love, and that's at the heart of what things they're happening into it. So much so that they decided to adopt, a philosophy where innovation is really a part of everyone's job, but they have a mandate around customer-driven innovation. So find an important unsolved customer problem that we and those we enable, so people inside of their value chain or their delivery channel or partners, can solve well and build durable competitive advantage. And so they embrace something called design for delight. So deep customer empathy, go broad to go narrow, and then rapid experiments with customers. So they had to create a little bit of a safe place to say, if you're inside of this number of customers, then you can have an accelerated and legal process, and risk will be okay. And here's some parameters that we can actually be in front of real customers to test with, but we're not going to do anything that's catastrophic while we're running experiments. So they had to do that, and all of that is part of their design for delight piece. Now, why did they go down this path of what they call rapid experiments? Well, ultimately, a few years back, they had a notion for quick receipts. So, hey, we've already got this data, and we think this would be a great idea. And we reached out to our customers and did a survey and said, wouldn't it be great if you could get e-receipts all stored in one place? And customers checked the box that said, yeah, sure, that sounds great. And so they went off. They built a business case. They had resources. They had money. They did requirements gathering. They built it. They foisted it onto the world. And what they found was, hey, 404, business not found. What customers will tell you in a 2-question survey or a 5-question survey does not actually mimic what they will do when presented with the opportunity to download an app, change their process, do 3 extra steps to gain benefit, et cetera, et cetera. So, they found that this notion of here's what they'll say does not necessarily follow the here's what they do. And so what they did was they borrowed a page out of Steve Blank's book and said, hey, no business plan survives first contact with customers. So the sooner you achieve first contact, the sooner you learn the truth. How do we change this so that we can get our ideas in front of real live customers and then understand what we can learn, have them pull us through this iterative process? And that led them down a pathway of saying, you know what, we want to move from Caesar to scientist, because we don't really, we can't sit around and guess at all the right answers inside of our own 4 walls. It's not working. And so what that meant to them was, we've got opinion-based kind of world where there's a lot of politics and, planning and flawless intellect and, assuming I'm right, and where there's an advocacy and selling kind of function. And, let's not kid ourselves. There's political capital that gets invested in these things too. I'm going to stick my neck out. The rewards might be big, but I might also get stabbed or lose my job because I attach my name to a very large, possibly transformative, possibly, completely explosive failure kind of project. And what if we stopped doing that and we moved more towards a scientist kind of approach? What if we let the data do the talking and we involve more than one person as we were doing it? And instead of sitting around and trying to get it right by thinking and planning and coming up with risk scenarios, we could actually just get out of the gate and start doing things and get us some of that data so we could make better decisions and iterate. Let's start from the assumption that we're wrong and then figure out what the data tells us. And at the end of the day, this might actually be fun. We might create some engaged employees out of it. So that led them down to set up a program where they were just sort of saying, listen, if we can make faster and more informed decisions, we all win. Let's reduce some risk. Let's minimize the amount of resources we require to test new ideas and move things through. Let's get more grist through the mill here, more ideas that we've had a chance to kind of play with and see if we can validate. Reduce or end some false positives and negatives, and then create some engaged employees along the way. So they did a whole bunch of work, 600 plus kind of what they called internal, small to medium-sized experiments. They touched 1,200 employees across the spectrum of their organization. And so does it pay out? Well, in Intuit's kind of view, yes. 20 million in new revenue from this experiment, multiple new ideas in market, some internal process improvements that were part of this process. They reduced the amount of resources required, and they drove some increased employee engagements in less than 18 months. So, their view was this has become a really important part of how they cultivate and validate new ideas and see what comes out of that to drive meaningful kind of results in their business. So in summary, if I can leave you with a couple of things this evening to take away, we've never seen hyperspeed as a rate of change. Startups are moving fast. Every industry is bleeding into the adjacent industries around it, and things are happening very quickly enough to make your head spin. Startups are really designed to search for repeatable, scalable business models. They're built on a bias for action and an agile learning kind of culture. And lean, while you'd be tempted to say it's fail fast, it's actually more about experimentation and feedback in an iterative process. The tools for this are the business model canvas and the customer development cycle, building on top of the lean loop. And the value prop can really be unpacked to be a summation of sort of the pains, the gains, and then the jobs to be done is how we express those for our customer segments. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Thank you, Mr. Drucker. And at the end of the day, Intuit says less Caesar and more Edison. At this point, really wanted to thank Bashir and the rest of the team for inviting me to come share this with you, and hopefully you've found some of these elements to be helpful. If you're interested in more about Mars, we're at marsdd.com. Feel free to have a look, and if you're through Toronto and have interesting questions or looking to sort of connect in a professional manner, then by all means feel free to drop me a line.